Welcome to another Mike Reads Reviews. Tonight we're going to be reviewing Thomas Reid's Active Measures, The Secret History of Disinformation and Political Warfare. Thomas is German, as in born and raised in Germany. So I'm not sure if the correct pronunciation of his name is Thomas Reid, which would be the German way of pronouncing it, or the Anglicization Thomas Reid, which is easier for me to say, easier for you guys to understand. So that's how we're going to refer to it until I find out what the actual and proper way to pronounce his name is. If you're supposed to pronounce it in the German manner, let me know in the comments section. Very briefly, the book was copywritten in 2020. So since this covers a very modern day subject matter, understand that it's not going to produce anything that's going to have transpired after 2020. And honestly, from memory, it stops its coverage right around 2018. So for posterity's sake, understand that copywritten in 2020. And what that book was that was copywritten in 2020 is a massively broad spectrum history of active measures. What are active measures? It's kind of a semi-archaic term for coordinated, intentional disinformation, almost always with a clear political end. So it's basically just an archaic version of what we would call today disinformation. It was a term that was used prior basically to the internet age, and especially in reference to those intentional and coordinated spreading of untrue statements and misinformation by the Soviet Union and the responses that were carried out by the U.S. intelligence agencies. When I say that it's a very broad or wide in scope, I also mean to imply, too, that it's not very deep. So although it covers a huge area and a huge time frame and a huge window, it doesn't really get into too great a detail, a depth, if you will, until about the last 50 to 100 pages. This is neither praise nor criticism. If you're just looking to scan the surface of a lot of things, the book does that. If you're looking for a ton of detail into one thing, the book doesn't really do that until the last 50 to 100 pages. And the book is in a bit of a chronology because it's a history. So the last 50 to 100 pages are the pages that cover disinformation in, say, the internet age and in the modern age. The book is 435 pages long, and in this case, I borrowed the paperback. So I have no information on the ergonomics of the hardcover version of that, and as you guys have seen through my reviews, I kind of prefer to buy the hardcover when I can. But what this was a book swap from a friend. So I get what I get with that, and we'll talk about that later in this review very briefly. But as far as the ergonomics are concerned, the only thing that I'll point out is that the print is tiny. And that's probably because it's already 435 pages long. If it was, say, a much more legible print, this would probably be like a 600-page long book. And I think you guys know, for those of you that have watched my reviews, where we're going to go with that when it comes time to do the review. But we're kind of still in the what it is, so you guys can get an understanding of whether or not you might be interested in the subject in the first place before we even get to my review. And again, in keeping in line with that, it starts to... as far as the width of the spectrum of coverage here, it starts with barely post-World War I attempts at disinformation that largely didn't even work, and it ends with the Podesta emails and the DNC hack and the shadow brokers, which is the most interesting part of the read. And I mentioned that it's 435 pages, and I mentioned that the last 50 to 100 pages are the most interesting part. I can't do this review, as we get into the review, without having a very stern conversation about concision. You guys know how much I like concise books. You guys know how much I like, we're in the middle of our series on Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. You guys know how much I like the short reads, especially if they're written in common parlance. So, I think you guys are going to know where we're going to go with that, and we're going to come back to that in just a brief minute. But this is a really important thing to bring up, because as I found myself reading through most of the book, it really turned out to not be my personal subject. It really turned out to not be the thing that I'm really, really interested in. I thought I would be, but then once it came, because I thought it would be more focused on a certain thing that I guess it wasn't, and it really isn't focused on any one thing. It's an actual historical account. And again, I know what people are going to say, well, if it's not really your subject, why did you even do it? Well, again, it was part of a friendly book swap where I loaned out Thomas Sowell's, I didn't bring it with me, Thomas Sowell's Charter Schools and Their Enemies to a friend, and he loaned me Thomas Rid's Active Measures. And, this is the second time I've actually done this, and I've actually had a very cool experience with, you guys can see the books on the bookshelf in the back. They're all books that I've either read or they're books that I'm actively making an effort to read. Right? There's some books on this hanging bookshelf, and there's some more books at home. I've actually, I would really, just as a complete aside from this review, part of the review is the experience that I had with, and have had it broadly, with just doing book swaps with friends. If you have friends and there's a subject matter that you really want your friends to read, and it seems like they're interested in it, just do it. Just do it. It seems to me like it's very useful and productive way to get information out, and it's a really useful and productive way to get books read, which is what we do here on this channel. So highly recommend doing that. And again, I'm glad that my friend was willing to lend me this book, because I don't know that I would have bought it. Let's see, how much was it? Yeah, $20 US, $26.99 Canadian. That's pretty cheap, but I don't know that I would have bought it, spent the money on it. So I'm glad that he was willing to, lend it to me. And and he said that he enjoyed Thomas Sowell's Charter Schools and Their Enemies, just as like the other friend that I've lent that book out to now. So, everybody winds up getting to, he spends the money on this book. I spend the money on Charter Schools and Their Enemies, and we do the exchange. So, this is a subject, however, that I could be interested in if it was done, I think, differently. If there was more of a focus on the two subjects where I think I have some serious interest in that subject, which is within the context of information warfare and technology, because these are things that I'm really interested in. If you guys could see the entire studio here, you'd see I've got a lot of that going on. Not the information warfare, but the tech. So it could have been, if it had been done correctly, I think the subject matter could have been broached in a way that would have been more interesting to me. And it suffered from, and the reason why I'm saying this is because it suffered from way too much time spent on these obscure, esoteric, completely irrelevant to today's conversation, historical elements of active measures and of disinformation. And in saying that, for those of you that saw my review on Andy Ngo's Unmasked, I can't help but compare and contrast the two, because inside Antifa's radical plan to destroy democracy, right? That's an incredibly interesting subject matter. So hurry up and get to that interesting subject matter, Andy. And that's exactly what he did, and a huge part of why I gave the book so much praise. Yes, Andy does go into a history of Antifa dating way back to World War II. In fact, to just prior to World War II. That's almost the same number of years of coverage, but he condenses the boring part of that history, the part that's at this point basically irrelevant to modern day Antifa, into about 20 or 30 pages, into one damned chapter. And the modern history that leads up to where we are with Antifa today, or at least where it was when Andy wrote this book, again, that's the part of the book that takes up the more of the pages than the 20 or 30 or 40 or so pages in one chapter that were spent on the broader, larger history of Antifa dating back to prior to World War II. So I think one of the things that Rid could have done to make this a more digestible read would be to condense the first 230 pages to one really long 40-page chapter on the early history of active measures and disinformation, which would basically be all that entire history from, I would say, 1927, I think is where he starts, somewhere in that area, to say 1970 to 1975, and then condense the next almost 100 pages down to another really long 40-page chapter on, say, the success years in the lead up to the internet towards the end of the Soviet Union. So that 1975 to 1995 to 2000, somewhere in that area. And then just leave the last 100 or so pages, which were really good as they were. Just leave them alone. And what you'll wind up with is a 180 page read rather than a 435 page read that would be way more digestible, way more accessible, and way more, if you might say, useful in spreading the information that Reed is trying to spread and getting the people, getting the common man, getting, the common reader to read this, to better inform themselves on this subject and to actually get through the entirety of the book, right? The first 200 pages of this book are going to put the common reader like me to sleep. And the common reader is just never going to get to the important and interesting stuff. Quite frankly, I think if you don't have a clear interest in this subject matter, if you're seeing this review, you're going to have to work through the first 200 pages to get to the interesting stuff. You do kind of have to read it because it's important to have like a basic understanding of that sort of stuff. But if you find yourself saying, all right, I'm skipping to the end of this chapter, in this first 12 or 15 chapters, just go ahead and skip to the end of the chapter so you can get to the interesting stuff. But I think that because it's so undigestible, right? And what I mean by that is that like things like in those first 200 or so pages, each chapter contains dozens and dozens of brand new names that are often only mentioned once and then are completely impossible to keep up with. And almost all of them are completely tossed aside after one or two mentions. It reads something like a soap opera. And quite frankly, I personally don't care about the players. I don't care about the players. What I care about are the events that take place, the actions that happen, and the documents, right? I want to see like the data. I want to have something of a more, I don't want to say sciencey book, but a read that if it's going to be this type of dry type of material, to read more like how Thomas Sowell might read, right? Where it's incredibly data driven and you're going to wind up as a result seeing a ton of citations. And in Active Measures by Thomas Reed, you're not going to see a lot of citations. I take that back. It's not going to be as rich and dense in citations as a work by Thomas Sowell. So in that case, I would compare it to Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, which we've also reviewed on this channel, which is nearly identical in the number of pages, right? They're both within 5 or 6 pages of 430 pages. And Thomas Sowell's citations pages, right? His work cited is over 100, well, it's almost 100 pages long. And the note, and in the case of Active Measures, instead, there's less than 60 pages of notes, which in many places aren't even citations. They're just further explanations because they're notes, not citations. And again, I'm not counting citations, right? I'm not saying more citations means more accurate. More citations means good. It's just generally speaking going to produce the type of read, the type of read which requires that many citations is much more data heavy rather than name and people heavy, which is more of my kind of a read. So since we're getting a bit long, let's get into the positives because there were a lot of positives in this book. For example, the language is very much common parlance. As far as it's not like he's talking above the reader like we have had in some of the reads that we've reviewed on this channel. Every talking point that he has in the book is sound. The history seems to be very sound. There's nothing wrong from what I can tell with the content itself. It seems also to be the seminal, let's call it entry-level work on the subject. And it doesn't set out to be more than what it is, and mostly succeeds at what it's trying to do. And on top of that, the last 100 pages were genuinely great. So I always close with a score out of 10. In this case, I wanted to give a caveat and let people know that when I do that, since we're on review number like 30 at this point, if you haven't figured it out, I do the final score at least as a review out of 10 based on my personal taste. So this isn't an attempt for me to give like an objective review with this score. I'm not like taking a step back and saying like, all right, what is never minding my personal preferences, what would I give this book, right? So this is just my personal take on the matter, and as it relates to my personal taste broadly in the subject as well. I'm going to give this book a 6 out of 10, which, by the way, still means it's not a bad book. Still means it's okay. 5 means I'm ambivalent. 4 means it was bad. 3 means it was really bad. And 1 or 2, I don't even think I've given out a 1 or a 2 yet. It's probably because I'm so used to on IMDb, if I give a movie a 1 out of 10 on IMDb or a 2 out of 10 on IMDb, it's a Mystery Science Theater movie. And although I've seen read some really bad books and some on this channel, they were at least books. So kind of reserving for that 1 or 2 in the event that I get 1 or 2 out of 10, and in the event that I get something that like I can't get through the first 5 pages because it's not even English. It's not even a book. So 6 out of 10 still means it's not a bad book. It's not great. It's maybe not quite good, but it's all right. And really that's mostly because the subject matter just turned out to not be that interesting to me. And it desperately needs to condense the first 300 pages. So that's been the entirety of the review. And I'll put a link in this video's description to where I don't know, actually, since I borrowed this book, I'm going to put a link in this video's description to a version of the book that isn't the big A, that you can get, or at least I'll do my best to put that link in this video's description. If not, Amazon actually does have some good reviews, so it's useful to go to them for those free reviews, and then not give them your money. So I'm not sure if I'm going to put a link in this video's description, come to think of it, because it may not be something that I can easily get outside of the big A online. But hope you have enjoyed my review of Thomas Ridd's Active Measures. See you in the next one. Night, folks.